Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first session, AI Pulse Check. I'm Catherine Sbeglia Nin with RCR Wireless, and I'm so pleased to introduce Tim Hatt from GSMA Intelligence. In his presentation, Tim will provide us with some background on the current state of AI development and adoption. It's all yours, Tim.
Thanks very much, Catherine, and great to be here. There is so much happening now with AI and telco AI specifically that I think it's really key we sort of go over this. And so what we've been doing a lot of analysis, a lot of research, and I just wanted to share some of that here to set the table for what undoubtedly will be, I think, a fruitful set of discussions and debate. So it's not what's happening, but what isn't. So let's go to the next slide. Um, I'll start out with telco AI overall, then talk about sort of distributed inference and edge AI, and because I think that's where a lot of the interesting kind of revenue models are emanating from, and then look at the outlook. And I'll talk for just over 10 minutes, and then we'll leave time for questions. So, next slide, which is just a little bit about us. Don't need to spend time on that. But if you want to get in touch about any of our research or analysis in this area or others, please do. All right, let's go to the next slide. So when we look at sort of the telco AI kind of sector and set of dynamics overall, there's a lot happening. And I think it's important to try to not boil the ocean, but rather understand where the priorities lie. And we think about this as an evolution over time. And then this data is from a survey of the mobile operators we ran, and it kind of indicates that, in green on the left are the low hanging for early wins, where we're seeing a lot around, as you'd expect, customer care, cost savings in the network, but also a huge revenue focus. And that's really key here. Monetization is essential. As we get further to the right, you have other, objectives over time. Those will play out, but right now we're sort of focused on the early priorities as people experiment and deploy the technology. Next slide, please. It's always helpful though step back and kind of understand when you could potentially talk about anything with AI. Are we talking about in the telco context, AI helping networks or networks helping AI? And this is not a new kind of way of thinking about it, but I think it's a helpful one. And a lot of this sort of early happenings in 2023, 2024 concentrated on the sort of how AI can help networks. Understandably, because you can automate, you can take costs out of the business and make things more efficient. Now, a lot of the focus is really moving to leveraging network capabilities with AI and with them new commercial models. And that's, I think, where we're seeing a lot of interesting stuff, especially at the edge. Okay, next slide. This is we our team tracks data from across the industry around what operators are doing with AI and how advanced it is. This is actually data from 2025 from a subset of 250 of the largest carriers across the world. And you can see the point to make on this slide is not so much what they're doing, but how far along the curve they are. And the black is sort of the commercial deployments versus the other colors being sort of in trial or planned. And you can see as the main point takeaway, a lot of the early deployments have focused on customer care and the sales touch points. That is, though, moving across to other functions, revenue generating functions as well. And so I think as we start to see a network effect play out as more operators demonstrate proof points and ROI, we'll see more of this chart start to become black over the course of this year and really over the next 18 months. So lots happening, is regional differentiation, but really we are at a commercialization phase. Next slide. Right. If you look at the telco sector, there has been this sort of inexorably rising curve of data traffic really since LTE. Why? Because LTE 4G was the first time that video streaming was really possible at scale, and that's what affected the original inflection point upwards in traffic. Now, this is even before AI kicks in. So if you look towards the end of the decade and a base case increase of 3x on current levels, The question then becomes, well, if AI is in play, how much does that change? Is it 20%? Is it 50%? Is it 80%? The short answer is no one knows yet, but we're starting to get a grip on how to track that. And I think the point to make from this slide is it will be important to understand the difference between direct AI traffic and indirect. Direct means originating from an AI native app like Gemini or ChatGPT, DeepSeek in China, others. Indirect means activity you might be doing anyways that's augmented by AI. Could be video, could be gaming, could be some other kind of enterprise application. Really important to understand this because operators will have to manage that traffic, but they're also going to try and monetize it. So if we can go to the next slide. And that brings me to the point on Edge AI. And we have been working on a pretty extensive analysis and research campaign this year, looking at the value of Edge AI with our partners Dell and NVIDIA and a number of mobile operators to understand A, what the USP is for it, and B, to really try and quantify the TCO and productivity benefits, as well as other attributes like data sovereignty, like energy efficiency, as I'm showing on this chart, to make the case for this as a commercial endeavor. If we can go to the next slide. Um, it's important to understand that, and this chart here is meant to be kind of just an explainer to show that inference along the edge doesn't happen at just one place. The edge is a continuum. It's a spectrum of computing power that moves progressively away from the cloud and towards the end user, be that a person or an enterprise or an IoT terminal where it's generated. And the point here is to say that both the cloud and the edge will have a role, of course, in the AI era. The cloud is where most of the model training will happen. That's the horsepower that gets behind the LLMs. The edge is really where a lot of the inference capabilities, that means the AI actually being generated in practice and where agentic AI is going to happen. And along that edge is where we see some really exciting use cases. So next slide. This is a selection. We put out we put out a big report in March, and then, as I say, a series of sort of smaller spotlight style case study reports to illustrate some of these use cases in practice. And what this chart is showing is kind of a business school style depiction of if you plot use cases between whether their primary objective is to generate revenue or save cost, and then secondly, whether they're at the enterprise edge, which is on the prem, or towards the device edge, where do things lie? And so the point here is different use cases have different, selling points. The top right is really about trying to make money and more in the enterprise domain. As you move further leftward, it's really more of a cost saving objective, which is where you see a lot of customer care. Um, Now, we show this because there is variation in the use cases, and it's important to understand the nuance so that a telco can orient its product and sales strategy appropriately. So next slide. These are some of the quantitative depictions showing the individual use cases I talked about. Um, I won't spend much time on this because this is being published in research, but just suffice to say that they show examples of this in practice in different dimensions. Next slide. Um, Also important to understand the network capabilities that need to be in play. What we're showing here is if you are a carrier running inference, running AI at the edge, what capabilities do you need to have in play in terms of sort of throughput, compute latency, traffic latency, energy efficiency, sovereignty, and others? And how do you orchestrate that in an overall network strategy? So this is really about having the readiness of a network to be able to capitalize on AI. Again, we don't have time to go into this in any level of sufficient detail here, but you can check out our research on our webpage, and this goes into that in detail. Next slide. Just a few examples. This is far from exhaustive, and this goes back into 2024. Really, the point here is to show, I think a lot of operators are looking at new models of new revenue models leveraging GPU or AI capabilities. And so whether that's GPU as a service, whether it's being able to monetize data to help train LLMs in non-English languages or other, we're seeing a lot of interesting experimentation here in Korea, the US, parts of Europe, and we expect that to expand. All right, I think last slide, which is just an outlook. And these are sort of deliberately posed as open questions. I, I'm sure it's not exhaustive as well, but I think this sort of sets, the table for this discussion today and many others like it happening across the industry. What do we take away? Well, it comes down to things like readiness. It comes down to how you think about future factors in inference versus cloud. And of course, it comes down to, P&L and network implications, because ultimately some of this does require new investment as we get towards the latter stages of the 5G investment cycle. But interesting, importantly, I think a lot of this comes down to sales strategy and culture in terms of how you do business in the AI era, being much more about kind of an IT consultant rather than a pure play connectivity seller, as perhaps in previous generations. So some food for thought. Hope that's been useful. I'm going to stop there, and I think Catherine's going to come back on, and we'll take some questions. So, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Tim. We got about 5 minutes for questions. We do have one here from the audience about where the traffic will land at the edge. Given the sometimes relatively thin network coverage at the edge, how much of the AI data and data processing stay at the edge?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, estimates vary. Historically, you know, the edge processing has been around sort of overall like 60%, 60 to 65%, with the core cloud taking up the rest. But that splits out a lot depending on whether you're talking about the device edge or the telco edge, which is like the RAN and then the OSS and BSS versus the on-prem. I think over time, we expect the edge to soak up an additional share of that additional incremental capacity, hence the need to invest in the network to be able to handle that.
Great, thank you. Based on the GSMA pipeline view that you showed us, customer care leads deployments, but is that where the strategic value lies, or is that just where it's easiest to start?
I think it's the start of something bigger. So, as I say, AI is going to touch all parts of the business. And the reason for starting a customer care is that it is relatively easier to automate than other functions. LLMs can learn and on the job and really help increase productivity. And for operators, it helps do two things. One is lower cost, but also get ahead of upsell and cross-sell opportunities. Um, we know from the data we're showing and others that this is going to extend and is extending to other parts of the business. Customer care is just one of the early proof points.
Mhm. We have a question here from the audience about what kind of new business use cases that we can get from AI and telco. Maybe you can just talk a little bit about kind of some new
Yeah.
opportunities.
Yeah, totally. And that was sort of, I think, on that slide showing the sort of colored dots across the different quadrants, that was the purpose of that. And so whether you're talking about examples like in robotics or digital twins in an enterprise setting, through to more in the consumer domain, like enhanced VR or AR, we're seeing a lot now being experimented with gaming and media, through to then more of the network centric use cases. I think there's a lot happening, and the GPU is a service where there's a partnership model between some silicon groups and operators to leverage that to enterprise clients. We see a lot of traction there.
Mhm. Yeah, excellent. We have about 4 minutes left. And this next question is maybe a big one, but with data traffic expected to triple even without AI and then potentially
Hmm.
double again because of it, how are telcos preparing their networks and business models for this compounding pressure?
Yeah, so it's not a new challenge. but there's a mixed approach. So part of it is adding spectral capacity straight up to soak up the load. Part of it is having a smarter network design. There's a lot happening as well with AI to improve the efficiency and the routing of data traffic more equally across a network footprint. Um, and I think now that you see so much happening in the enterprise, we're going to see a lot more kind of smarter traffic offloads in combination with fiber and Wi-Fi to optimize that traffic load. On the other side of the coin, though, we are seeing a lot of efforts to monetize it.
Mm.
And that's really where a lot we're seeing in the AI at the edge. Those models I talked about, we think there's a lot more to come there.
Okay. We have another interesting audience question. With the proliferation of neo cloud providers and the ready availability of GPUs from all sorts of companies and hyperscalers and others, how would telcos offer value through GPU as a service and edge inferencing? Basically, where do they fit in here,
Yeah,
right?
so that plays to the unique selling proposition. So of course the hyperscalers are in play and will continue to do so with the computing scale that they command. For operators, you've got to think about assets around compute latency, around energy efficiency, around cost savings from not having to backhaul data to the cloud, and around data sovereignty, which means being able to keep data in the area that it was generated to comply with regulatory obligations. So those are sort of the key selling points I think that operators can really pitch to be relevant in this space as GPU as a service and other AI edge models.
Okay, excellent. And for our last question, I know you talked a little bit about where the traffic will land at the edge. That was one of our audience
Mm,
questions. But maybe you
mm.
can also talk about, you know, the enterprise demand for edge AI. How real is that demand, and what infrastructure gaps must be filled for telcos to deliver on that?
So enterprise traffic as a share of the total continues to rise, which is a good lead indicator of enterprise demand. Um, We think that, I mean, with the AI, it's a lot of the activity sort of builds on some of the 5G assets that have already been selling into enterprise. But playing on those kind of USPs that I talked about in the previous answer, um, that's where we see a lot of the activity. And in terms of early industries, I would call out manufacturing. I would call out airports and other transport authorities, and even healthcare settings as being among the early adopters.
Okay, great. So that's all we have time for. Thank you, Tim, and thank you to our listeners for all the questions.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.